them all what I'm made up. Strut down the hall, won't stop till I get enough.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something pretty significant that's just happened. It's about the arrival of a group of white South Africans here in the U.S. Our main information for this comes from a Guardian report published just today, Monday, May 12th, 2025.
Yeah, and our goal really for this deep dive is to try and unpack what happened, go beyond just the headlines, understand the key events, why they happened, and the different reactions people are having. We'll look at the source material, the different perspectives in it.
And I think what jumps out straight away is this decision by the U.S. administration to actually grant refugee status to this group, South Africa.
Well, it's not typically a country you associate with, large refugee flows to the U.S., so the reasoning is already causing a stir.
Exactly. Granting refugee status here, it definitely raises some questions, especially if you think about the usual framework. Normally, refugee status is for people fleeing persecution, race, religion, nationality, that sort of thing, with a real fear of harm if they go back. Okay, so let's look at the specifics in the article. This first group, they arrived today, Monday, May 12th, at Dulles Airport near D.C.
And it wasn't a quiet arrival either. They were met by U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau and also Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security Troy Edgar, that kind of official reception.
Yeah.
It tells you this was a deliberate policy move, right? High-level stuff.
That's right. And the numbers, well, they varied a bit in the first reports. Reuters said 59, citing the State Department. AP said 49. But either way, it clearly got immediate attention. And one thing that really stood out was they were given U.S. flags to wave as they arrived.
Yeah, the flags, that's quite a visual, isn't it? It sort of suggests a narrative the U.S. administration wants to project, like a welcoming, bringing them into the fold based on why they were supposedly let in.
Exactly. So let's dig into that U.S. perspective. The Guardian piece is clear. This was President Trump's administration granting refugee status, and Trump's public reason was, well, very direct. He called the Afrikaners the minority group descended mainly from Dutch colonists, victims of a genocide.
Genocide. I mean, that word carries enormous weight. Historically, legally, it means the deliberate, systematic destruction of a group, using it for white South Africans. Well, that's a claim that isn't widely supported by evidence. Many see it as, frankly, a fringe theory.
Right, and Christopher Landau, speaking there at the airport, he really leaned into this, said it was an honor to receive them. And he made this pretty striking comparison to his own father leaving Europe when Hitler rose to power.
That parallel, drawing a line to the Holocaust, it's a very powerful rhetorical tactic. Landau said explicitly the U.S. was sending a clear message, rejecting racial persecution in South Africa, so positioning it as this big moral stand.
But here's where it gets, well, maybe more complicated. Landau also mentioned why they were chosen for resettlement. He said, and this is a quote, that they could be easily assimilated into our country. And he apparently made that point right as temporary protections for Afghans were ending.
That contrast is very telling. It suggests that this idea of, easy assimilation was part of the calculation. It raises big questions about the criteria being used, doesn't it? Are there biases at play? What does easily assimilated even mean here?
Precisely. And the article notes that Trump prioritizing this group over maybe others fleeing famine or war seems tied to that genocide claim. It also points out that this claim echoes a far-right conspiracy theory, one that's been amplified by people like Elon Musk, apparently.
It's useful to understand what that conspiracy theory generally involves. It basically argues white South Africans face systematic genocidal violence, often by exaggerating crime stats or, misrepresenting the really complex realities of post-apartheid South Africa.
And Trump also mentioned talks coming up with South African leaders next week. He even hinted he might skip the G20 summit in Johannesburg if, quote, the situation is taken care of. So applying pressure.
Definitely sounds like diplomatic pressure. It suggests this isn't just about U.S. refugee policy in isolation. They're actively engaging, maybe even using leverage with South Africa over how they see the situation.
Okay, so how did South Africa respond? President Cyril Ramaphosa, the article says, spoke to Trump on the phone. And Ramaphosa told him the information he had about discrimination against white South Africans was, well, false.
Right. So a direct challenge to the U.S. narrative. Ramaphosa is saying this genocide claim is based on bad information, and he suggested it comes from people who oppose the government's efforts to fix the huge racial inequalities left over from apartheid, redress.
But he did say that while they believe the U.S. misunderstood things, South Africa wants to keep talking, keep the dialogue going.
which sounds like a diplomatic way to try and de-escalate. South Africa probably sees the implications here and wants to engage, clarify their view.
The article also gives some important background context on South Africa itself, socioeconomically. It mentions that white South Africans, on average, have something like 20 times the wealth of black South Africans. That's from the Review of Political Economy. And unemployment, way higher for black South Africans, 46.1% versus 9.2% for white people.
That economic gap is huge, and it's crucial context. It highlights the legacy of apartheid, the ongoing struggles for real equality. So when Ramaphosa talks about addressing inequalities, this data shows what he means. It also complicates that simple narrative of white South Africans being this uniformly persecuted group.
Exactly. So moving on to the reactions this whole thing has caused. There's a nonprofit director at the airport, Laura Thompson-Osuri from Homes Not Borders.
Yeah.
She had a sign saying, Afrikaners are not refugees. And her argument was basically that the policy seemed based on, well, how these people look, their ethnicity.
Yeah, her protest really puts the spotlight on who counts as a refugee and why. She's suggesting this might be about prioritizing based on identity, not the standard assessment of persecution risk.
And it wasn't just activists. Democrats in the U.S. condemned it too. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen called it an outrageous insult. He even used the phrase global apartheid policy, which is obviously very strong language.
That language from Senator Van Hollen really underscores the sharp political divide on this in the U.S. Calling it a global apartheid policy connects it directly to historical racism and segregation, rejecting the administration's rationale completely.
And maybe one of the most striking reactions, the Episcopal Church. They've ended their long-running work with the U.S. government on refugee resettlement. Why? Because they were asked to help resettle these white South Africans. They cited their commitment to racial justice and reconciliation.
Wow. That's a significant move from a major church group. It signals a really deep ethical disagreement with the policy, to the point where they walked away from decades of partnership. Their reasoning racial justice suggests they see this specific policy as going against those principles.
Okay, so let's try and pull the main threads together here.
Yeah.
We have the U.S. under Trump granting refugee status to white South Africans, citing genocide. This sparks major controversy. You got pushback from South Africa, from refugee groups, from U.S. politicians. And the U.S. rationale, mentioning easy assimilation, clashes with criticism that it's based on ethnicity, not need, all set against this backdrop of deep inequality in South Africa.
Right. And I think the really, the aha moment maybe is that clash you mentioned, the U.S. focus on easy assimilation versus the criticism about ethnic preference. It just highlights the different ways you can view this, the assumptions behind each perspective about who deserves refuge, how society works.
Absolutely. And for you listening, understanding this whole event, it gives you a window into current debates, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Debates about immigration, about what refugee means, how we interpret discrimination globally. It makes you think about the factors driving these decisions.
And it leaves us with a big question to chew on, really. Thinking about all the history, the economics involved, what does it mean when one country decides who is persecuted based on criteria like this? And what could the ripple effects be? You know, for global migration, for international relations down the line. Definitely gives you something to think about.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.